Hi, everyone. Today's lesson is on the major literary forms. These are the three main genres of literature that we're going to be covering this year. And our first literary term lesson. We're going to be talking about the main genres of literature. We're not going to get into the subgenres because, as you know, even within a specific genre like novel, there are many, many genres like historical novel, historical fiction, fantasy, mystery, etc. We're going to focus on just a few main types as we go through these notes. Which brings me to my next point. We do need to be taking notes on these flipped lessons, and we are going to use those notes in class. So we're going to practice different note-taking strategies throughout the year, and these are really important for you to have as part of your toolkit for college. So the form we're going to use today is a formal outline. Formal outlines are appropriate for taking notes from a textbook or from a presentation such as this, where there are slides or PowerPoint, something that is specifically outlined. So if you do not know how to use a formal outline or you've never done one before, you can find tons of information online. Go to really any college website and there's lots of note-taking help, or just Google how to do a formal outline and you can find that information very easily. So pause and then come back to us when you are ready. Okay, so today we're going to focus on poetry, and this genre is slightly different because it really focuses on the expression of feeling and emotion more than anything else. And like this quote from Robert Frost, it's sort of the words that are used to express an emotion. Another thing that's important to remember about poetry is that we cannot separate style from content. So the form itself, the style in which the poem is written, and the meter, the rhythm, whether it's a haiku or an ode or a villanelle, those are all really important in determining what the theme of the poem is or what the author's intention was in writing the poem. So our first type of poetry is epic poetry, and this is the oldest form or genre of poetry. Epic poetry was started as an oral tradition, which meant that it was a story that was told by word of mouth, and even more specifically, it was sung. And the person who sung the poem was called a bard, and they would usually play a harp or a lyre, or a string instrument, and they would sing their poems to the listening crowd. So because this was an oral format, it was told, with different flair, with different elements and details by each bard, and they kind of changed up the story just as family stories are passed on and little pieces are changed here and there. So by the time the stories were written down, when the act of writing came into play, these stories weren't necessarily written by one specific person. Sometimes they had been told or kind of co-written by many different people or many different bards. So with epics like Beowulf and Gilgamesh from around the world, those epics don't have a specific poet attached to them. However, stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by mainly one person, which was Homer. Not to say that he didn't have help, but he is the person who actually recorded and wrote down the story. The secondary epic came a little bit later, and we are going to be reading excerpts from Paradise Lost. And the difference is that these were not told orally; these were first written down, and they were told in the or they were written in the epic format. So similar to the epic is the chivalric romance, and these stories were very epic-like in their nature. They were sometimes long poems or kind of long tales, and they focus on a knight or a hero who was out to win the heart of a damsel. And these focused on things like courtly love and the idea of chivalry. The two other main forms of poetry that are very important are dramatic poetry and lyric poetry. Dramatic poetry is sort of the more narrative type of poetry, and it tells us a story. Lyric poetry is really that feeling and emotion poetry. It doesn't necessarily have a story, it may just express an author's feeling, emotion, or thoughts at a given moment. So a type of dramatic poetry that's very common is the dramatic monologue. And this is a speech or a monologue given by a speaker. And it's important to remember that the speaker is not the same as the poet. So the speaker is an invented character who is telling a story or giving a speech about something. And it's usually set up so that they're speaking to someone. That someone may be named or not. And we are the secondary audience of the monologue. And the monologue is given at a specific point in time with usually a specific story to tell or a specific theme or message that the speaker wants to express. Now, some interesting things with this genre. We can really use the dramatic monologue to analyze character because it's told in a narrative format. We can look into the speaker's word choice and the way that they're telling the story in order to infer specific character traits or to learn about the character. And in doing so, that exposes the theme or the meaning of the poem. However, we can also look out for unreliable narrators. So sometimes the narrator of a dramatic monologue can't really be trusted. Maybe they've committed a crime, or they don't have the whole story, or they are telling us only, their perspective. So we need to also look out for an unreliable narrator, which also tells us something about the poet, him or herself. So the poet's tone or the poet's message may be slightly different from that of the speaker, especially if the poem is a satire. So a satire can sort of mislead us if we don't understand the sarcasm or the irony that's being used. Satire should be something that you're somewhat familiar with. Last year in 11th grade, hopefully you read A Modest Proposal, and I think you watched some Monty Python as well. So satire is a genre that we find in all different types of writing. It is a genre of comedy or a comedic element. And there are two main types of satire that we'll talk about in a minute, but both types really just focus on a human foible or a folly or a vice that the speaker or the author wants to criticize. So, in formal or direct satire, something very specific is being criticized, and the audience is also very specific. So, it's being directed at someone or a group of people. Wherein indirect satire is not as pointed. It's sort of just happening. It's not directed at the audience. The audience is just an observer. The they're not necessarily the target of the satire. So just slightly different. It's good to know when something is a formal satire. So A Modest Proposal is a formal satire because it was very direct and it was pointed at a very specific group of people. So within those two types of satire, there can also sort of be these levels of seriousness. And Horatio and Juvenal were the two people that created satire. They created the genre. And Horatio, he was much more lighthearted about his writing, and it wasn't as serious and it wasn't as biting and cynical and criticizing. So if we're reading something that's sort of a little bit on the lighter side, or watching something like Monty Python or like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, those really fall into the realm of Horatian satire. However, Juvenal was much more serious and he wasn't afraid to offend. And so Juvenalian satire is a little bit harsher. A Modest Proposal falls in here, as does some of Mark Twain's work, which is really specific and it was directed at specific audiences, and it was really harsh and critical. So those are the main differences in the types of satire. And in the next video, we're going to learn about fiction and drama and the main genres there. But just keep in mind that satire can be found in any of these types of writing. Okay. Finish up your notes. Make sure that you looked up that formal outline, and I'll see you in the next